I discovered just how vindictive a homeowners association could be on the coldest December morning Colorado had seen in 15 years. When I found a certified letter taped to my front door informing me that my backup generator was now officially banned from operation within the Pine Ridge community. My name is Samuel Richardson, and I had moved into this upscale neighborhood just outside Boulder 3 years ago, drawn by the mountain views and what seemed like a quiet, reasonable community. I worked from home as a software consultant, which meant reliable power was not just a convenience but a necessity for my livelihood. The previous winter, we had experienced a series of rolling blackouts that lasted for days, and I had lost nearly $10,000 in missed deadlines and angry clients. That was when I decided to invest in a proper backup generator system, a quiet natural gas unit that cost me nearly $8,000 to install professionally. The generator sat on a concrete pad behind my house, enclosed in a sound-dampening housing that reduced the noise to barely more than a refrigerator hum. I had checked the HOA covenants before installation, finding nothing that explicitly prohibited backup power systems. The installation was done to code, inspected by the county, and positioned well within my property lines. For 8 months, it had been a non-issue, firing up automatically during the 2 brief outages we had experienced and keeping my home office running smoothly. Now, apparently, it was the worst thing that had ever happened to Pine Ridge community. I read through the letter twice, my breath forming clouds in the frigid morning air. The message was signed by Deborah Winters, the HOA president, a woman in her early 50s who seemed to view the neighborhood as her personal kingdom. The letter cited a newly amended HOA regulation, passed just 2 weeks ago at a meeting I had not been notified about, that banned all generators, backup power systems, and auxiliary power equipment from operating within the community due to noise pollution and aesthetic concerns. The real kicker was the fine structure. Every day my generator remained operational would result in a $500 penalty. If I failed to comply within 7 days, the HOA reserved the right to place a lien on my property. I stood there in my driveway, the letter trembling slightly in my cold fingers, and felt my jaw tighten. This was not about noise or aesthetics. My generator was quieter than most air conditioning units and completely hidden from street view. This was about control, about Deborah Winters flexing her authority because she could. I went inside and immediately pulled up the HOA portal online, searching for any notice of the meeting where this regulation had supposedly been passed. Nothing. I checked my email, my physical mail from the past month, even my spam folder. There had been no notification, no agenda posted, no opportunity for homeowners to attend or voice concerns. According to Colorado HOA law, which I quickly researched, associations were required to provide reasonable notice of meetings where covenant changes would be voted upon, typically at least 10 to 15 days. I drafted a careful email to Deborah, keeping my tone professional but firm. I explained that I had received no notice of the meeting, questioned the validity of a rule change made without proper notification, and requested copies of the meeting minutes and vote count. I also pointed out that my generator met all county codes and was essential for my work. Her response came within an hour, which surprised me. What did not surprise me was the complete dismissal of my concerns. Mr. Richardson, the meeting was properly posted according to HOA bylaws. Your failure to attend is not our responsibility. The regulation is valid and enforceable. You have 6 days remaining to ensure compliance. Regards, Deborah Winters, HOA President. I called an attorney that afternoon, a real estate lawyer named Patricia Gomez who had helped me with my home purchase. She listened to my situation and sighed in that particular way lawyers do when they are about to tell you something you do not want to hear. "Samuel, technically you can fight this, but it's going to cost you significant time and money," she explained. HOA disputes typically take months to resolve, sometimes years if they dig in. You would need to prove they didn't provide adequate notice, which can be tricky if they claim they posted it somewhere, even if you never saw it. Meanwhile, they can keep fining you and potentially file a lien. So I'm just supposed to let them bully me into removing a legitimate piece of equipment I need for work. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to weigh whether this fight is worth potentially thousands in legal fees and the stress of an extended battle. Sometimes the pragmatic choice is to comply and look for other solutions. I thanked her and hung up, feeling the frustration building in my chest. This was America, supposedly the land of property rights and individual freedom. Yet here I was being told I could not operate a legal, code-compliant piece of equipment on my own property because a power-hungry HOA president said so. That evening, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear my head. The temperature had dropped to near zero, and the weather forecast predicted it would stay brutally cold for at least the next 2 weeks. As I walked past the community park and recreation area, I noticed the utility building that housed the well pump and pressure system for the neighborhood. Pine Ridge was not on city water. We had our own well system that served all 43 homes in the development. I had been to an HOA meeting once, about a year ago, where they discussed the water system. The pump house was climate-controlled, but the heating system was old and apparently somewhat unreliable. There had been talk of upgrading it, but the discussion had devolved into arguing about costs and been tabled indefinitely. I remembered Deborah dismissing concerns about the heater, saying it had worked fine for 20 years and would be fine for 20 more. I stopped walking and looked at the small brick building, steam barely visible from its vent in the cold air. An idea began forming, one that made my anger transform into something colder and more calculated. The next morning, I went back to my computer and dove deep into the HOA's governing documents, the ones that were public record and available to all homeowners. I read every single page of the covenants, conditions and restrictions, the bylaws, and the architectural guidelines. What I discovered was illuminating. The water system, according to the HOA covenants, was the responsibility of the HOA to maintain and operate. All homeowners paid monthly dues that included water service. The system had to meet county health department standards, and any disruption of service lasting more than 24 hours required the HOA to provide alternative water supplies to residents. More importantly, I found that the utility building that housed the pump was actually on a small parcel of land that was designated as common area, but was not connected to the community's power grid in the same way the homes were. It had its own service, and interestingly, that service ran through an easement that crossed my property line. The easement was legal and properly recorded, giving the HOA the right to maintain power lines across the back corner of my lot to reach the pump house. But the document also specified that the property owner, meaning me, had to consent to any modifications or upgrades to the easement infrastructure. It was a standard clause meant to prevent the HOA from doing something crazy like installing a cell tower or transformer station without the adjacent homeowner's input. I leaned back in my chair, thinking. Then, I went outside to examine the actual power setup. Sure enough, there was a utility pole at the back of my property, right near my property line, with lines running from it across the open space to the pump house about 100 yards away. The pole itself was on my land, installed as part of the easement agreement. The plan that had been forming crystallized into something concrete. If Deborah Winters wanted to play hardball about my generator, I could make life interesting regarding her water system. I was not going to sabotage anything or break any laws, but I could exercise my rights as a property owner in ways that would create significant problems. First, I needed more information. I spent the next 2 days researching Colorado property law, easement rights, and utility regulations. I also made some calls to the county offices, asking hypothetical questions about easement maintenance and property owner rights. What I learned was that while the HOA had the right to maintain the existing infrastructure on the easement, they needed my permission for any emergency work that required accessing my property beyond the narrow easement corridor. And they absolutely needed my permission for any system upgrades or modifications. On the 4th day after receiving the letter, with 3 days left until my supposed deadline, Deborah called me directly. "Mr. Richardson, this is Deborah Winters. I wanted to follow up personally regarding the generator situation. I have not received confirmation that you will be in compliance by the deadline. That's because I have not decided yet," I replied calmly. "I'm still reviewing my legal options." "There are no legal options." Her voice took on that sharp edge that people in petty authority love to use. "The rule is the rule. If you do not comply, we will begin assessing fines and move toward placing a lien on your property. I would hate to see this escalate." "I'm sure you would," I said. "Tell me something, Deborah. When exactly was the meeting where this rule was passed?" "The November 15th meeting, as stated in the letter." "And how was that meeting announced?" "We posted a notice on the community bulletin board at the park, as we always do." "Not online, not via email, not via mail. The bylaws only require posting on the community board." "Most residents check it regularly." "I see. And how many homeowners attended this meeting?" There was a pause. "I do not have the exact number in front of me, but we had a quorum. A quorum being 7 homeowners, according to the bylaws, in a community of 43 homes." "Mr. Richardson, I do not appreciate your tone. Whether you like it or not, the rule was properly passed and is enforceable. I strongly suggest you comply." She hung up before I could respond. I sat there, phone in hand, and made my decision. I was not going to roll over for this petty tyrant. That afternoon, I drafted a formal response letter to the HOA. In it, I stated that I disputed the validity of the regulation change due to inadequate notice, that I would not be removing or disabling my generator, and that I would contest any fines through the formal dispute process outlined in the HOA bylaws. I sent it via certified mail and email to create a paper trail. Then I made a second call to my attorney. "Patricia, I need you to draft a letter for me regarding an easement on my property." The deadline came and went. I received another letter, this one informing me that I was being fined $500 per day, with the total currently at $1,500 for 3 days of non-compliance. The letter threatened that if I did not pay within 30 days, they would place a lien. I filed a formal dispute, which according to the HOA bylaws had to be heard within 60 days. That would buy me time. Meanwhile, the cold snap that had started the week, I received the first letter intensified. Colorado was experiencing one of the coldest Decembers on record, with nighttime temperatures dropping well below zero and daytime highs struggling to reach 15 degrees. The local news was filled with stories about frozen pipes, heating emergencies, and record power consumption. On the 12th day of the standoff, I was working in my home office when I heard a loud bang from somewhere outside. It was late afternoon, nearly dark, and the temperature was hovering around -5 degrees. I went to my window and looked out but saw nothing obvious. 20 minutes later, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my neighbor from 2 houses down, Robert Chen, standing there looking concerned. "Samuel, sorry to bother you, but do you have water?" I went to my kitchen sink and turned it on. Nothing came out. "No, you. Nobody on our street does." "I've been checking. Someone called the HOA emergency number, but it just goes to voicemail." I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. The pump must have failed. In this weather, that's really bad. Deborah's house is on the other side of the neighborhood, on the north side. They have water because they are on a different section of the system. I tried calling her cell, but she's not answering. "Did anyone check the pump house?" I walked over there. The door's locked and I do not have a key, but I could not hear the pump running. I grabbed my coat. "Let me come take a look." We walked through the bitter cold to the pump house. As Robert had said, the door was locked with a heavy padlock. I pressed my ear against the door and heard nothing, no mechanical hum, no sound of water moving. I walked around the small building and noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The vent that should have been releasing warm air from the climate control system was not producing any steam or vapor, unlike every other time I had seen it. "The heat's out," I said. "The pump probably froze." "Jesus, that's going to be expensive to fix, and we could be without water for days in this cold." We were not the only ones who had noticed. Over the next hour, as word spread, nearly 20 homeowners gathered in the community park area, everyone bundled against the cold, trying to figure out what to do. Someone finally got through to Deborah on her cell phone, and she said she would be there within an hour. It took her 90 minutes. She arrived in her luxury SUV, looking annoyed at having been disturbed. She parked and marched over to the pump house with a set of keys, several of us following. When she opened the door, we were hit with air that was barely warmer than outside. The interior was maybe 30 degrees. Water dripped from frozen pipes and the pump sat silent. Deborah's face went pale. "When was the last time anyone checked this?" someone asked. "We have a maintenance company that's supposed to check it weekly," Deborah said, her voice tight. "In weather like this, maybe they should have been checking daily," Robert suggested. Deborah shot him a glare. "I will call the emergency repair service. Everyone just go home. We will have this fixed as soon as possible." "What are we supposed to do for water?" a woman named Jennifer asked. "You will have to make do, buy bottled water. This is not my fault." "Actually, it kind of is," I spoke up. Everyone turned to look at me. "The HOA is responsible for maintaining the water system. If the maintenance company was not checking it properly in this extreme cold, that's an oversight by the HOA board." "Mr. Richardson, I do not need you stirring up trouble," Deborah snapped. "We are handling it." "Are you?" Because according to the HOA covenants, if water service is disrupted for more than 24 hours, the HOA is required to provide alternative water supplies to residents. That means delivering bottled water to every house. Her face flushed red even in the cold. "I am aware of our obligations." "Good, because I'm going to hold you to them," the crowd murmured. Deborah looked like she wanted to say something cutting, but with everyone watching, she just turned and pulled out her phone to start making calls. I walked home, that cold satisfaction growing. This was not my doing, not directly, but the timing was certainly interesting. The water system had failed during the worst cold snap in years, right when I was in a dispute with the HOA. While I had not caused the failure, I was certainly not going to go out of my way to help fix it quickly either. The next morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I answered to find a stressed-sounding man introducing himself as Larry Mitchell from Front Range Pump Services. "Mr. Richardson, I'm calling because I'm trying to coordinate repairs to the Pine Ridge Community Water System. I understand the power service to the pump house runs through an easement on your property." "That's correct." "Well, we need to bring in some equipment to thaw the pipes and repair the pump. The problem is we need to upgrade the electrical service temporarily to run some high-capacity heaters and get that building warmed up quickly. The current service is not enough. We would need to install a temporary power panel on the utility pole on your property." "That would be a modification to the easement infrastructure," I said calmly. "It's temporary, just for the emergency repairs. But it still requires my consent as the property owner. That's in the easement agreement." There was a pause. "Sir, people do not have water." "This is kind of an emergency." "I understand that, and I'm sympathetic to my neighbor's situation, but I have my own situation with the HOA right now. Have you spoken with Deborah Winters about this? She's the one who gave me your number and said to call you for permission." "Interesting. Tell her I need to discuss this with her directly before I grant any permissions. Have a good day, Larry." I hung up and waited. It took less than 30 minutes for Deborah to call, and she was furious. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" she shouted into the phone. "You are holding up emergency repairs." "I'm exercising my rights as a property owner," I replied calmly. "The easement agreement requires my consent for modifications. You want to modify the electrical setup, even temporarily, you need my permission. This is an emergency. People do not have water. Then maybe you should not have picked a fight with me over my generator." Silence on the line. Then her voice came back, colder. "Are you seriously holding the neighborhood's water hostage because of your generator?" "I'm not holding anything hostage. I'm simply pointing out that you need my cooperation, just like you demanded I cooperate with your questionable generator ban. Funny how that works, is it not, you bastard? I will sue you personally for obstructing emergency services." "Go ahead. My attorney would love that." "While you are at it, explain to the judge why you passed an HOA rule change without proper notice, and why you are fining me $500 a day for operating legal equipment on my own property. I'm sure that will go great. What do you want?" "I want you to rescind the generator ban." "Absolutely not." "Then I guess we're at an impasse. Good luck with your water situation." I hung up. I knew I was playing with fire. My neighbors would be without water, and that was genuinely unfortunate. But I also knew that Deborah had created this situation through her own arrogance and overreach. She could end it any time by simply backing down. Over the next 6 hours, my phone rang constantly. Other HOA board members called, trying to negotiate. Neighbors called, some angry, some pleading. I explained my situation to each of them. How Deborah had implemented a rule without proper notice. How I was being fined $500 a day for operating equipment I needed for work, and how this was about the HOA abusing its authority. Most people seemed sympathetic once they heard the full story. A few were angry at me for not just caving, but I stood firm. That evening, there was an emergency HOA meeting called, properly noticed this time with emails and calls to all residents. I attended, walking into the community center to find it packed with cold, frustrated homeowners. Deborah stood at the front, looking exhausted. When she saw me enter, her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing. The meeting was chaos. People were angry about the water situation. The repair company had given an estimate that fixing the frozen and burst pipes in the pump house, plus replacing the damaged pump and upgrading the heating system to prevent future failures, would cost nearly $40,000. That would require a special assessment on all homeowners, or draining the HOA's reserve fund. "This is unacceptable," one homeowner shouted. "Why was not the pump house being monitored better in this cold?" "We pay a maintenance company," Deborah said defensively. "They are supposed to check it weekly. Weekly is not enough when it's -10 outside." Someone else yelled. Then Jennifer, the woman from the previous night, stood up. "I want to talk about why the repairs are being delayed. I heard that Samuel Richardson is blocking access to the electrical service." All eyes turned to me. I stood up calmly. "That's not exactly accurate. The repair company wants to make modifications to the electrical infrastructure on an easement that crosses my property. Per the easement agreement, I have to consent to modifications. I have simply declined to give that consent at this time." "Why?" several people asked at once. "Because 2 weeks ago, Deborah and the HOA board passed a rule banning my backup generator, a rule that was voted on at a meeting I received no notice of, despite being required to by law. I'm being fined $500 a day for continuing to operate legal, code-compliant equipment that I need for my work. When I tried to discuss this reasonably with Deborah, I was dismissed and threatened. Now suddenly the HOA needs my cooperation, and I'm supposed to just give it without question." The room erupted in competing voices. Deborah tried to restore order. "The generator rule was properly passed," she insisted. "Where was the meeting notice?" someone called out. "On the community bulletin board." "I never look at that thing," another person said. "Why didn't you send emails? We've always used the bulletin board for meeting notices." "That's ridiculous in 2024, Robert Chen said, standing up. "Everyone communicates electronically now. If you're going to change community rules, you need to actually inform the community." The meeting devolved further. It became clear that most residents had no idea about the generator ban and were upset about the lack of proper notification. Several people pointed out that they might want backup generators themselves given the power reliability issues. Finally, a man named Thomas spoke up loudly enough to cut through the noise. "I propose we vote right now to rescind the generator ban. All in favor?" Nearly every hand in the room went up except Deborah's and 2 other board members. "That is not how this works," Deborah protested. "The board makes policy decisions." "Actually," I interjected, "according to the bylaws, any rule change made by the board can be overturned by a vote of the general membership at a properly noticed meeting. This is a properly noticed emergency meeting, and we have way more than a quorum present. The vote is valid." Deborah looked like she was going to explode. "Fine. The generator restriction is rescinded. Now will you grant permission for the repairs? I need that in writing, and I need written confirmation that all fines assessed against me are voided." "Someone draft something," Deborah snapped at another board member. It took 20 minutes, but they produced a document on a laptop and printed it stating that the generator restriction was rescinded effective immediately, and that all fines assessed against my property were voided. I read it carefully, had several witnesses watch Deborah sign it, and then sign my own consent form for the temporary electrical work. I handed the permission form to Deborah. "Pleasure doing business with you." She snatched it from my hand and immediately got on the phone with the repair company. The repairs took 3 days to complete. During that time, the HOA had to rent a water truck and deliver bottled water to every house, which cost them several thousand additional dollars on top of the repair costs. The total financial hit to the HOA was over $50,000 between repairs, emergency service fees, and the temporary water service. In the following weeks, there was significant fallout. A petition circulated calling for Deborah's removal as HOA president. She had created an expensive disaster through poor maintenance oversight, and then made it worse by getting into a power struggle she could not win. At the next regular HOA meeting, she was voted out of her position by a wide margin. The new president was Robert Chen, who ran on a platform of common-sense governance and better communication. One of his first acts was to implement a new policy requiring all meeting notices to be sent via email in addition to any physical postings, and requiring that rule changes, directly affecting individual homeowners, have a comment period before being voted on. The generator ban debacle also prompted several other homeowners to install their own backup power systems. When the inevitable spring storms caused power outages in March, 5 houses in Pine Ridge rode them out without issue, mine included. As for Deborah, she became a pariah in the neighborhood. She had never been particularly popular, but now people actively avoided her. She would walk her dog past houses where people would suddenly remember they had to go inside. At neighborhood gatherings, conversations would dry up when she approached. 6 months after the water system disaster, she put her house on the market and moved to a different community in Fort Collins. I did face some criticism for how I handled the situation. A few neighbors felt I had been too aggressive, that I should have granted permission for the repairs immediately regardless of my dispute with the HOA. I understood their perspective, but I also maintained that rolling over in the face of unjust authority just encourages more unjust use of that authority. The truth was that I had not caused the water system failure. I had not sabotaged anything or broken any laws. The system had failed due to inadequate maintenance during extreme weather, which was entirely the HOA's responsibility. I had simply exercised my legal rights at a moment when doing so created leverage in a dispute I did not start. Could I have been more charitable? Probably. Should I have just accepted the generator ban and moved on? Absolutely not. There are times when you have to stand up to petty tyranny, even when it is inconvenient, even when it makes you unpopular. Because if you do not, it only gets worse. The legal aftermath was minimal. The HOA never did place a lien on my property since the fines were voided. Deborah made noises about suing me personally for the repair costs, claiming I had intentionally delayed emergency work, but her attorney apparently talked her out of it. Any lawsuit would have opened up discovery on the HOA's maintenance failures and the improper notice of the generator ban meeting, neither of which would have looked good in court. I did have one final conversation with Deborah before she moved away. I ran into her at the grocery store in Boulder, both of us reaching for the same bag of coffee. She saw me and her expression hardened. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she said coldly. "I am not particularly proud or ashamed," I replied. "I stood up for my rights, that's all." "You cost the HOA $50,000 and made everyone suffer without water in the middle of winter." The HOA cost itself $50,000 by not maintaining its equipment properly. I just declined to help fix a problem I did not create until you stopped trying to bully me. You are exactly what is wrong with this country. No sense of community, no willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. I felt my own anger rising. You want to talk about community and sacrifice. You tried to force me to give up equipment I need for my livelihood because you did not like it. You used your authority to target me specifically without proper process, and when I pushed back, you threatened to put a lien on my house. You're not some community servant, Deborah. You're a petty tyrant who got drunk on a tiny bit of power. I'm glad you're leaving. The neighborhood will be better off. Her face went red. For a moment I thought she might actually throw the coffee at me, but instead she just turned and walked away without another word. I stood there in the coffee aisle feeling oddly empty. There was no triumph in having won that confrontation, just a tired sadness that it had been necessary at all. Over the following months, life in Pine Ridge settled into a much healthier rhythm. Robert Chen proved to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on actual community needs rather than nitpicking control. The water system was properly upgraded with better climate control and monitoring systems. Communication improved dramatically with regular email updates and an active community forum online. The HOA also implemented new rules about rule changes, requiring proposals to be published for community review at least 30 days before a vote, with opportunities for affected homeowners to provide input. It was common sense governance that should have been in place all along. My own life returned to normal. My generator continued to sit quietly on its pad behind my house, rarely needed but there when necessary. I had learned an important lesson about standing up to authority, but also about the costs of that stand. Some of my neighbors remained uncomfortable around me, viewing me as the guy who had held the neighborhood hostage. Others respected what I had done, seeing it as a necessary pushback against overreach. I became more involved in the HOA after that, attending meetings regularly and volunteering for the Architectural Review Committee. If I was going to live in a community with an HOA, I figured I should participate in making sure it functioned reasonably. It was not something I particularly enjoyed, but it beat the alternative of leaving governance to people who saw it as a power trip. The story made its way around Boulder's HOA community, becoming a cautionary tale about what happens when association leadership forgets they are supposed to serve homeowners, not rule them. I even got a call from a local news reporter who wanted to do a story about HOA overreach, but I declined. The situation was resolved, and I saw no benefit in publicly embarrassing Deborah further or turning my neighborhood into a media circus. One unexpected positive outcome was that it brought several neighbors and me closer together. Robert Chen became a genuine friend. We would have beers on his back deck and laugh about the absurdity of the whole situation. Jennifer, who had initially questioned my actions at the meeting, later apologized and said she understood why I had done what I did after learning the full story of how Deborah had treated me. "The thing is," she said over coffee one afternoon, "people like Deborah count on others being reasonable and willing to back down. They use that reasonableness as a weapon. Sometimes you have to be unreasonable right back to make a point." That summarized it better than I could have myself. The financial impact on the HOA was significant but not catastrophic. The special assessment to cover the repair costs came out to about $800 per household, spread over 6 months. Most people grumbled but paid. A few tried to argue that Deborah should be personally liable since it happened under her leadership, but that went nowhere legally. There was one final twist to the whole saga that came nearly a year later. I received a phone call from an attorney in Denver representing 3 other homeowners in a different HOA community. They had heard about my situation and wanted to know if I would be willing to speak with them about their own dispute with an overreaching HOA. "I'm not looking to become some kind of HOA whistleblower," I told the attorney. "I understand, but your situation created precedent that could help my clients. The way your community overturned the improper rule change by membership vote has given us a strategy we did not know was available." I ended up spending an hour on the phone with him, explaining what had happened and what I had learned about HOA governance and property rights. I never heard back about how their situation resolved, but I hoped it helped. Looking back on the entire experience now, almost 2 years later, I have mixed feelings. I am glad I stood my ground. The generator ban was unjust and improperly implemented, and giving in to it would have set a terrible precedent. But I also recognize that the way I chose to fight back created real hardship for innocent people, my neighbors who had nothing to do with the dispute but suffered without water in brutal cold. Could I have found another way? Maybe. I could have immediately sued the HOA over the improper notice and fought it out in court while complying with the ban in the meantime. But that would have cost me tens of thousands in legal fees with no guarantee of success. I could have just disabled my generator and hoped for the best regarding power outages. But that would have put my livelihood at risk and taught the HOA that aggressive bullying works. Instead, I used the leverage I had when I had it. Was it manipulative? Yes. Was it ethically questionable? Probably. Was it effective? Absolutely. And in the end, it led to positive changes in how the HOA operated that benefited everyone in the community. The experience taught me several important lessons. First, always read your HOA documents thoroughly and know your rights. Second, document everything in disputes because paper trails matter. Third, sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to hit back hard enough that they think twice about bullying anyone else. And fourth, there are costs to every choice, and you have to be willing to live with them. I still live in Pine Ridge. My generator still sits on its pad, quiet and reliable. The HOA functions reasonably under sensible leadership. And every time I hear that generator kick on during a power outage, I remember that sometimes defending your rights requires being willing to make people uncomfortable, including yourself. The real irony is that the whole situation could have been avoided if Deborah had simply communicated properly in the first place. If she had sent an email proposing the generator restriction and explaining her concerns, I would have had the opportunity to address them before any rule was passed. We could have discussed noise levels, shown that my generator met all reasonable standards, maybe even established community guidelines for backup power systems that everyone could live with. Instead, she chose the authoritarian approach, and it cost her dearly. It cost the HOA $50,000. It cost me weeks of stress and significant time dealing with the dispute. And it cost the community goodwill and trust that took months to rebuild. But in the end, the system worked after a fashion. An unjust rule was overturned. An ineffective leader was replaced. Governance improved. And people learned that HOAs, despite their power, are still ultimately accountable to the homeowners they serve. I wish it had not taken a water system freezing and an entire neighborhood going without water in the middle of a Colorado winter to teach those lessons. I wish I had not been put in a position where exercising my legal rights meant making life harder for innocent neighbors. But I do not regret the choice I made. Sometimes you have to be willing to let things break before they can be fixed properly. The last time I saw the pump house, during a walk on a pleasant fall evening, I stopped and looked at it for a moment. It had new siding, a upgraded heating system with redundant backup, and monitoring equipment that would alert the HOA instantly if temperatures dropped too low. It was better than it had been, more reliable, less likely to fail. That improvement happened because of a crisis that happened because systems that should have worked did not, and people who should have acted responsibly did not. I continued my walk, hands in my pockets, enjoying the cool air and the first hints of autumn color in the trees. Somewhere behind me in my backyard, my generator sat ready. Somewhere in Fort Collins, Deborah was presumably terrorizing a new set of neighbors, and somewhere in the HOA files, there was documentation of the whole mess, a reminder of what happens when petty power goes unchecked. Life in an HOA community requires balance. You are part of a collective with shared resources and mutual obligations, but you are also an individual with rights and property. Finding that balance is not always easy, and sometimes it requires conflict to establish boundaries. But once those boundaries are established, once everyone understands both the rights and the limits of the association's authority, things can function smoothly. Pine Ridge functions smoothly now. We have reasonable rules, reasonable enforcement, and reasonable people in charge. My generator is no longer an issue because it never should have been one in the first place. The water system works because it is properly maintained. And the community has learned that good governance requires actual communication and genuine responsiveness to homeowners' concerns. It took a fight to get there, an ugly fight that nobody really won. But the place we ended up is better than where we were, and that has to count for something. Sometimes progress is messy. Sometimes standing up for what is right means being willing to look like the bad guy. Sometimes the only way forward is through conflict rather than around it. I would not want to go through it again. But I would make the same choices if I had to, because the alternative was accepting an unjust exercise of power, and I have never been good at that. My generator still runs when the power goes out. The water still flows from my taps, and life goes on in Pine Ridge, quieter now, calmer, but forever changed by one very cold December and the battle of wills that came with it. The neighborhood has returned to being a pleasant place to live, and I have returned to being just another homeowner rather than the guy involved in the great generator controversy. Time moves on, seasons change, and the drama fades into just another story people tell occasionally about HOA craziness. But the lessons remain, carved into the community's bylaws and processes, subtle reminders that power without accountability leads nowhere good. And on cold winter nights, when the wind howls down from the mountains and the temperature drops below zero, I sometimes stand at my window and look out at the neighborhood. Lights glow in windows. Smoke rises from chimneys. And in the distance, if you know where to look, you can see the small brick pump house, properly heated now, quietly doing its job of keeping water flowing to every home. It works because people fought to make it work better. It is reliable because failure had consequences. And the next time someone proposes a rule change in Pine Ridge, people pay attention and ask questions and demand proper notice, because they have learned what happens when they do not. That might be the most important outcome of everything that happened. An engaged, informed community that does not just defer to board authority but actively participates in governance. It is not perfect, and it requires effort, but it is functional in a way that serves everyone rather than empowering the few. My generator continues its quiet vigil, ready when needed, proof that sometimes defending the small things matters because they represent larger principles. Property rights matter. Due process matters. Proper notice and fair procedures matter. And when those things are violated, pushing back matters, even when it is inconvenient and uncomfortable. The story could have ended differently. I could have backed down, and Deborah could have continued her reign of petty tyranny until the next person dared to challenge her. The water system could have failed without my leverage bringing attention to the maintenance failures, maybe at a time when it caused even worse problems. Or I could have been more vindictive, held out longer, made people suffer more, turned a legitimate dispute into pure spite. Instead, we found a resolution that, while messy and painful, ultimately improved the community. That is the best outcome anyone could reasonably hope for in a dispute like this. Not perfect victory, not complete vindication, but a better situation than what existed before. And really, that is all you can ask for when dealing with the complicated reality of shared community living in America's homeowner associations. They are flawed institutions, capable of both maintaining property values and enabling petty tyranny. The key is having people willing to engage, to push back when necessary, and to insist on reasonable governance even when it is easier to just go along. I learned I was one of those people during that cold December. I did not particularly want to be, but circumstances demanded it. And in the end, everyone benefited from someone being willing to say no to unjust authority, even at personal cost. The generator still runs. The water still flows. And in Pine Ridge, when someone proposes a new rule now, the first question asked is whether everyone was properly notified and had a chance to weigh in. That might seem like a small thing, but it is the foundation of functional democratic governance, even at the HOA level. Sometimes it takes a crisis to make people remember that foundation. Sometimes it takes someone being stubborn enough to fight over a generator to remind everyone that rights matter and process matters and fairness matters. I did not set out to be that person, but when the moment came, I did what I thought was right. I would like to think Deborah learned something from the experience, but I honestly doubt it. People like that rarely do. They move on to new situations and repeat the same patterns until someone pushes back again. But at least in Pine Ridge, the community learned something. They learned to pay attention, to question authority, and to demand accountability. Those lessons were expensive, costing $50,000 and 3 days without water in bitter cold. But they were worth it because they changed how the community functions at a fundamental level. The price was high, but the alternative, continuing under leadership that saw homeowners as subjects rather than members, would have cost far more in the long run. So I stand by my choices, questionable as they may have been. I stood up when it mattered, used the leverage I had, and ultimately helped create positive change. The method was controversial, the timing was painful, and the optics were terrible. But the outcome justified the approach, at least in my view. Others may judge differently, and that is their right. Some will always see me as the guy who held the neighborhood hostage over a generator. But I know the truth of what happened, and I can live with the choices I made. That is all anyone can do when faced with impossible situations. Make the best choice you can see at the time and live with the consequences. The consequences in this case were better than I had any right to hope for. A tyrant removed from power. Governance improved. Rights protected. Community strengthened through adversity. Those are outcomes worth fighting for, worth enduring criticism for, worth the stress and conflict and ugliness that came with standing firm. My generator remains a symbol of that stand, a quiet declaration that some things matter enough to fight for. It sits on its concrete pad, enclosed in sound-dampening housing, ready to provide power when the grid fails. Just like I was ready to use what leverage I had when the HOA failed in its duties, both the generator and I did exactly what we were supposed to do. We provided backup when primary systems failed. And Pine Ridge is better for it, even if the path to improvement was rocky and the journey was unpleasant. Sometimes that is how progress happens, not through careful planning and unanimous agreement, but through conflict and crisis forcing necessary change. I can live with that. I can live with being the person who said no when everyone expected compliance. And I can live in this community, knowing that it is better now than it was, in part because someone was willing to fight when it mattered. The generator still stands ready. The water system still operates reliably. And life continues in Pine Ridge, shaped by lessons learned the hard way during one very cold December when power, both electrical and political, became the center of a battle that changed everything. That is my story, complicated and messy and imperfect, but ultimately a story of standing up for what is right even when the cost was high and the outcome was uncertain. I would not change it if I could.